Hi, this is Rachel Maddow. I've learned my lesson after 2.5 years of, I'll just say, slightly excessive coverage of a singular story. Which is why, in light of the AIPAC meeting, it's time to turn a new leaf and get back to some actual very serious questions about the Trump administration. Did you know during the transition that Michael Flynn was lobbying foreign governments against the Obama administration's policy of abstaining a UN resolution against Israeli settlement expansion? This raises really serious questions. This is a time now where AIPAC has Democratic Party leaders smearing Ilhan Omar, one of the most promising young women of color leaders in our country. Is this Israelgate? Watergate was over 40 years ago today. Whitewater was over 20 years ago today. But is it time for Israelgate? I don't know. But when we come back, we're going to ask how this will affect Vladimir Putin. I can't take it. How does it affect it? Russia, 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 Russia.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Yo.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
David Slavic is roaming the digitosphere in the ever-expanding, ever-global, potentially Russian influence, no, I'm just playing, TMBS universe. On this week's program, Francesca Fiorentini. She's the host of the Bitchuation Room, stand-up comedian, former Al Jazeera Plus journalist. We're talking about AIPAC. We might be making fun of McCain together a little bit. Get her thoughts, potentially, on Russia as well, the Mueller report. Matt Taibbi. We just recorded this before we went live. He's talking about the structural failures of this story and what it tells us about the modern state of our democracy and oligarchy, the fights we actually have to win, and the terrifying prospect that this might actually have been a political gift to Donald Trump. But we're going to explain how that can fight to make it not a gift for Donald Trump, potentially. We have some shout-outs to give as Lyft and Uber drivers go on strike. Bernie stands with graduate students in the University of California system as he goes across the country campaigning for president. In the post-game, we're doing a lot in the post-game tonight. And of course, in the main show, we have a Griscom economic update. In the post-game, we're going to have an extended global update. AMLO's first 100 years in office. South Africa's elections are in motion. They're set for May. 3 main parties are campaigning as rolling blackouts hit that country. There's more to cover from AIPAC. There's an extraordinarily disturbing new Israeli ad. Me debating another Mayo brain on I-24. That one was interesting. And a new segment with the Logic Man himself, Ben Burgess, author of Give Them an Argument. For the next several weeks, he's going to be joining us for on the phone for brief post-game segments for patrons where we debunk a right-wing argument. This one, he's taking on the taxation is theft argument, which you've had the misfortune to do call-in internet talk. You have heard before. All that and much, much more on this edition of the Michael Brooks Show. Is the music still playing, Matt?
Yeah.
All right. It's not. Okay, cool. That needs some new headphones. But let's start with this. I have spent at least a year saying, let's wait till this report comes out. And there's 2 things that I've never been invested in either way. I've never been invested in some type of grand conspiracy narrative that will explain all of modern politics to me, because here's the bottom line. Even if you found the most radical and extreme Tom Clancy version of the Russia story, it would still not be as important as oligarchy, as white supremacy, as the historical and economic and social trends that allowed someone like Donald Trump to get into the White House. And conversely, I wasn't invested in saying the thing was total bullshit either. Seemed like there was some sketchy connections. There was a meeting here and a meeting there. Things almost never turned out in the reporting of it to be as melodramatic as initially reported. And obviously, it's not wise to take the intelligence service's words for it. But Donald Trump fired James Comey. Like, there were actually things that happened. So it seemed wise to wait for this report to come out. And I also have to tell you, while I thought maybe, very unlikely, but maybe this would reach a Don Jr. as an example, the idea that this would actually indict Donald Trump as sitting president was shockingly far-fetched, to put it politely, and profoundly unlikely from a career political mandarin like Robert Mueller, who should mainly be known for horrific persecution of the Muslim community as well as his role in the Iraq invasion. But that being said, the Mueller report has concluded, and it has suggested that there will be no further indictments. And let's go. First things first. Here's Bernie breaking down what everybody, whether you're on the left Russia skeptic, or certainly if you're on some type of resistance lane, and if you're just an American who wants to know where all your money and time went into, this is what all of our perspectives should be.
Before I begin my remarks, I want to mention to you what most of you already know is that the Bob Mueller investigation was submitted to the Attorney General. Now, I haven't read the report yet. It hasn't been made public. I think I have something in my email box right now. We're reading it after this. But what I know is that it is a summary of the report. Well, I don't want a summary of the report. I want the whole report. Because nobody, especially this president, is above the law.
Absolutely. And even as we rightly dunk and mock the intelligence services, Democratic leadership, and Rachel Maddow and all these other figures, we need to demand it be fully released. And we also need to be just as attentive to all of Trump's authoritarian tendencies that he is going to work this story into to delegitimize any debate and questioning of his regime. The Democratic Party was too focused on the theory, and some believed that Trump would actually be taken down by this. This has to stop. We have to beat Donald Trump not because he's some Russian agent, but because he's a white supremacist with fascist sympathies who's putting children in cages. We have to beat Trump with politics, not with conspiracy theories. If the Democratic Party was interested in collusion, it had a clear evidence of Trump's team colluding with a foreign power before he came into office. Jared Kushner directed Michael Flynn to contact Russia to oppose or delay a vote on the expansion of Israeli settlements. This task was specifically at the behest of the Netanyahu government. But don't take my word for it. Take Ron Dermer's word for it, the ambassador from the United States to Israel, who said from Israel and the United States, who said, obviously, we reached out to the Trump transition team and hoped that they would help us. And they were helpful, and that they would speak to other governments in order to prevent a vote like this from happening. Now, that sounds something like collusion to me. The Democrats have gone so hard on this theory that Trump is Putin's puppet that it's overshadowed the wealth of evidence that Trump has governed and ran his campaign in a criminal manner. There was such hope that some blockbuster conspiracy would be uncovered that would whisk us all back in normalcy if we just supported the FBI and the intelligence services. Bernie shows us the way here in that clip we just saw. Release the damn report. And I have no doubt if you release the damn report, it will show many embarrassing things about Donald Trump. And I also have no doubt, as Taibbi and I get to later, that if you framed it as a broader conversation about oligarchy and corruption in Washington, well, it would humiliate, maybe even put Donald Trump in jail, but it would also humiliate and maybe put lots of other political leaders in jail, or at least greatly diminish their careers. We also need to be profoundly suspicious of empowering the FBI and Justice Department over democracy. Look at Brazil. If you empower an unelected branch of government, it can be used to subvert democracy and will inevitably used to attack the left. Democracies are complicated, and Democrats need to reckon with Trump's victory and not make the same mistakes of 2016. But despite this ridiculous Mueller cult, the fact is that Trump is still wildly unpopular. And unless the Democratic Party really screws it up, he will lose in 2020. This is why there is no reason to not pursue a bold, progressive agenda that is, by the way, extremely popular, not just because it will beat Trump, because it's what the country needs. It cannot just give people, you need to give people something to vote for, and you need to defeat the underlying conditions that lead to Trump and Trump-like things. Per a report from The Intercept, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee announced to political strategists and vendors that if they supported candidates mounting primary challenges against incumbent House Democrats, the party will cut them off from business. This is a direct attack on the progressive movement and winning. And actually, it sounds a little bit like collusion, if I could be immature for a second. It is a direct attack on the progressive movement, which has been gaining power and producing America's most important young leaders. And while the DCCC has always worked to push out leftists and progressives, making this policy public is a significant shift and an attempt to intimidate progressive campaigns. We've seen it with Ilhan Omar. We've seen it with Rashida Tlaib. And God knows we've seen it with Bernie Sanders and with AOC. The Democratic leadership wants to avoid engaging in real politics with their base, just as they've avoided doing it with Trump. We don't need Mueller or Schumer or Pelosi to save us. We have to save each other from the scourge of Trumpism by taking political power away from the few and bringing it to the many. Do you guys have anything you want to add to that? I'm happy that we have not. And frankly, I'm also, happy that we didn't definitively say something the other way on it.
Look, I mean,
Sat back, see what they say. But now if it's like, well, wait till the fifth Mueller report. And by the way, I just have to say, this does not cover New York Southern District or emoluments cases or any number of other potential massive corruption about Donald Trump. And in fact, if you just came out of the gate and said this motherfucker is almost certainly corrupt, great. That would have been a far more, and frankly, I'm much more disturbed and interested in the relationship between the Trump and the Mercers than the Russians.
exactly. You know, it's like I'm pretty happy. Look, I want to see the full report, and definitely anything that we can use against Trump is something that we should use, right? Because he's a bad person, he's a criminal, he's a monster. We need to defeat him. Right. But this kind of escapist fantasy that's been going on for so long has been so bad, not only because it sort of made people miss the ball and not pay attention to what's really going on, it's also has made people not reckon with the fact that Trump is very much an American product. He's very much something that is of this country, and this whole idea that Russia was behind the discord in this country. It's like, no, the country is divided because we are at a very
Russia created the Ferguson police.
Yeah, exactly.
Russia created more inequality than the medieval ages.
I mean, it's ridiculous.
Russia created the college admissions scandal. Russia created, every social pathology and economic inequity and racial injustice, of which, again, this is just history, the modern Democratic Party has been a willful co-pilot on. Russia didn't force Bill Clinton to sign welfare reform. Russia didn't force Joe Biden to destroy bankruptcy laws across this country. Russia didn't form a bipartisan consensus to strip away investment in rural communities and inner cities and put more people in prison than anywhere else on the planet. So even if the most intense conspiracies were true, and of course Russia wants to interfere in our elections as we interfere in theirs and so on, look at the weakened immune system that we have created, capitalism, white supremacy, all of these variables that have allowed them to even play that role, let alone allowed Donald Trump, who literally is like a personification of every economic and social ill conceivable to humans. I mean, he's fused in one person. He's like the 99 Summer Jam of bad things.
Griscom and I were talking a little bit about, seeing Bernie figure out a way to sort of partake, because I agree with what the content of what he said there. I mean, I made a lot of my political education was coming up like doing Nixon tape type things or JFK conspiracy type things, and all that is like Freedom of Information Act. Give us that shit because it's ours.
Yep.
Like you work for us, and I think that is a really good principle. I also know that like as soon as Bernie tweeted anything about the Russia stuff, you had Eric Garland being like, "Well, what about Tad Devine? This bullshit, right?"
Oh my God.
So it's like but this is a way basically Bernie can not only say the right thing that you should say, but he's leaning into it a little bit with like it's sort of like how he said, "We don't care about your damn emails," and how like a big swath of people could look to that as something they agreed with, whether they were Hillary bots or like Bernie bros.
Right.
It's a similar. This is a similar genre of I think rhetoric for him. Where
What I think is funny is that if people weren't so ridiculous, they would actually find a lot of things like that from him.
Yes.
Right. Like if you actually were watching his speeches and you weren't just mediated through this like bizarre irrational hatred that like some very odd people on the internet have for him, you'd find a lot of that. And I also think like Eric Garland, I mean, look, if we're doing account keeping here, okay, that guy's a joke, whatever. There's all these hysterical, although I kind of have a soft spot for the Krasensteins. Oh, yeah. But like, you know,
Game
there's all these like
game.
ludicrous people that have risen up in the, you know, Robert Mueller comic book genre. And when, I mean, and again, I don't, look, I had crazy hopes in the middle of the transition before Trump was inaugurated. I didn't really think so, but I get it. I'm not sitting here and pretending like I think to be mortified and terrified and disgusted by Trump is a quite natural and healthy human reactions. But some of us also did not look at a Twitter thread that literally had no intellectual internal coherence from some random consultant guy and say, this looks like the Federalist Papers. I mean, you had people who have, and again, even someone like Clara Jeffrey, it's sort of like she pops up as like this ridiculous character on Twitter, but that's a pretty, you know, editing Mother Jones that's a strong platform, particularly, I mean, honestly, even just, it still is, but even relative 2 years ago before an even greater proliferation of alternative media within alternative media. So you had people, very credible and serious people, embracing just like nonsense.
Well,
I mean, not even like just a wrong interpretation of whatever. That's fine. Everybody does that. And it would be arrogant to pretend otherwise. But things that were like on their face, nonsense.
No, and like, that's the one thing that really, for me, over the past couple of years of this whole Russiagate, you know, story, I think one of the most frightening stories for me was Prop or Not. I don't know if y'all remember that, but this was supposed to be some think tank that was being able to tell whether or not organizations were, you know, Russian agents or not. And the Washington Post, you know, released this entire report on it and, you know, accepted it as fact. And we still don't know who's behind it. I don't know if you've been on it recently. It's just some weird person who's just like tweeting and still trying to antagonize for folks. And there's still people who believe in this organization, even though it's been thoroughly discredited. And that's something that's been very frightening to me, is to see smart people look, because there's always going to be loonies. There's also always going to be people who I disagree with. But smart people whose intelligence I respect, who have been able to be wrapped up because they really wanted to believe in this story, has been very frightening for me, just generally politically.
And that's
you don't
the
know how to
impulse to
interact
question.
with them.
That's the impulse to question. Like literally, our only saviors are ourselves.
Exactly.
With each other in solidarity. Like there's no magical escape. There isn't the Deus Ex Machina device for this. This is real life. All right. Let's go to the Shoutout, because it's a great example of people in real life doing incredible things that we need to do.
Shout out, creepy. Shout out, weird. I think that's creepy. It's your problem. Shout out.
This is out of control. So Uber and Lyft drivers are on strike in LA over pay and working conditions. I'm going to quote now from the NBC News report on this. Some Uber and Lyft drivers in Los Angeles held a 25-hour strike Monday to protest wage cuts and working conditions. The work stoppage was spurred by Uber's recent announcement of a 25% cut in drivers' pay per miles in Los Angeles. That's a really big cut. And parts of Orange County. Hundreds of drivers from both Lyft and Uber protests during the day outside of Uber's offices in Redondo Beach, California, according to Rideshare Drivers United, an advocacy group. Here's some footage of it right now. We're going to play for you. I don't know if there's sound on
A
it.
household full-time. Now makes driving part-time useless and driving full-time impossible. Uber and Lyft.
So this is the scam economy, of the share economy. This thing that was so hyped even as recently really as like 2012 as this incredible innovation in how people gain and share products and services, which first of all, out of the gate already at least favored people that had some access to basic resources, an apartment, a home, or a car as an example. And then the margins of the service have been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed by these predatory companies that haven't really produced any significant innovation. They have an app innovation and they have terrifyingly accurate surveillance of us innovation. But all the rest of it is just like, yeah, it's a slightly easier way to do a cab. That's all it is. And it's been terrible for the environment. It's added to congestion. It's increased pollution.
Just one quick point. It's a way to hail a cab using things like GPS and such that were developed by the military and
that were developed by the military state. Precisely. And then it builds on the fraud of each person as an entrepreneur. So when people already knew, like, okay, when Walmart calls somebody that they're totally just devastating as part of their maximally ruthless global supply chain an associate, we all know that it's like a cruel joke and corporate feudalist PR at its most sort of baroque and grotesque. But Uber and Lyft are actually going out there and making arguments based on the notion that they're a platform for some type of third-party agreement with these drivers, that these drivers are not employees of massive corporations, but in fact, you know, co-participants in a platform, which is demented because of the power asymmetry. Marshall Steinbaum, who I think we'll have on the show soon, puts this out as well. And this is really important. This goes back to the GEM commentary, by the way, on how check it out on our YouTube channel, how IPOs increase inequality. This is Marshall Steinbaum. These companies are going to IPO for north of $100 billion. Their entire business model is regulatory arbitrage. That's exactly right. And he's quote tweeting Vina Dubai, "Today I'm standing in solidarity with thousands of Uber and Lyft drivers in strike in Los Angeles. This incredible historic action is a result of some of the most beautiful and courageous organizing I've ever seen." Check out, this is, you know, I think people are pretty versed in checking out Wall Street pharma, oil and gas, and arms manufacturer contributions, but really be just as on Silicon Valley. And then really briefly, there's a group of graduate students, excuse me, I said California before, that was my mistake. They're organizing at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Like many grad students, they're overworked and underpaid. So we stand in solidarity with them, and we also wanted to point out that there is a presidential candidate, the Democratic frontrunner, in fact, Bernie Sanders, who doesn't just pay lip service to these things. He went to campaign on that campus and specifically stood with them and called out the administration.
And he just tweeted about it, too, in support and solidarity.
And he tweeted out, which makes it a nationally visible thing. That is leadership.
That's something that the administrations weren't banking on prior to this, right? Like that's something
exactly
that
right.
completely changes how they. I mean, imagine them like sending emails to each other. How do we respond to this?
And that's also a prototype, if we are able to complete the effort of getting Bernie Sanders elected president, of the literally of what does it look like when you have a person in the White House who has the machinery and there's going to be endless amount of blocks, but actually cares about an actual agenda, and then how it correlates with all of the vital necessity of like those grad students doing what they need to do in that courageous step. All right, we're going to do a little pitch, and then we're going to get back with Francesca Fiorentini. So guys, it is definitely time to get your tickets to the TMBS live show at the Bootleg Theater in Los Angeles, April 20th, with special guests Anna Kasparian, Big Waz, Wozni Lambre, and Nando Vila, and of course us. Tickets are going fast. We're over halfway sold out. As I always say, if the rate continues, if it happens like last time because there's less tickets overall available, we'll be sold out. People actually like strolled up to the ticket box day of at the Bell House and bought tickets, and that was great, and we filled it up. But I think there's about 50 less tickets to this location. So,
And it's the first time anybody from our orbit has done a live show on the West Coast.
that's right. This is a big deal. And it's the same deal. There's VIP tickets. A bunch of people bought those. You can come and hang out with all of us for a couple of hours, which is actually pretty fun very fun. Talk and get to know people and, but just please no modern monetary theory questions. No, I'm just kidding. You can ask whatever you want. Much love to modern monetary theory. Actually, direct all modern monetary questions to David Griscom.
Have a little booth.
I will talk to you about Thomas Sankara and Lula. And Matt will be like, Oscar Wilde. Sure, I'll take a beer. No, actually, you know what?
Griscom's going to be about that, too.
No, I know. You guys, actually, all kidding
about that.
aside, what are your briefs? I'm taking Sankara, Lula. Matt, what are your briefs for questions for the VIP?
I mean, I'll take any sort of generic, like sort of JFK or Nixon conspiracy stuff.
Boom.
And literature stuff.
Beautiful.
I will take your recipe questions, your questions about country music, and I'll talk a little modern monetary theory if people really want to.
All right, but be ready. So get your tickets, guys. We can't wait to see you. There's going to be game shows up there. We're going to do more pre-recorded sketches. You know that that's going to be an insanely fun show. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Woke Bros on the Bomb feed. Waz and I do that show once a week, and it gets more and more popular. That's a show. There's a wind behind that show, is all I'll say.
That's a very good feed, both of those shows.
Oh, yeah. The
go out
Monday
on
Black
that.
Opinions Matter show is
Yep.
awesome. Some of the all the Counted Things podcasts I keep up to, but the sports properties are now with The Athletic, which is awesome. Guys, we need you to become a patron of the show. We're working on a system to make all of the archives more accessible. But in the meanwhile, I think we're going to start tweeting out lists maybe of like search terms that you can use to find all of the back shows on Patreon. There's illicit histories of fascism in Silicon Valley. There's histories of Jamaican politics and gang warfare. There's histories of great revolutionary like Thomas Sankara. There's idea primers on CLR, James, and other iconic thinkers. There is a report on the transition from apartheid South Africa to democracy with our friend and crew, Mike Hanna, who was there covering it and worked in the 1980s for a radio station which was the only democratic media in the last decade of apartheid South Africa. Bhaskar Sunkara on the Russian Revolution. Just not to mention the candidate guides. Joe Biden, Beto O'Rourke. Huge amount of content there. And it's how we keep growing and sustaining all of this, obviously. If you're new to our YouTube channel, click subscribe. We're at over 36,000. We're going to obviously our next basic goal, we would like to by sometime next week be up to 40,000 because we're moving fast. So let's get there. Spread the word. Patreon.com/TMBS. Patreon.com/TMBS. We're going to take a brief break and we're going to be right back with Francesca Fiorentini.
my father. I mean, my father. 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 My father's my father. 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 Father. My father. My father's my father. I mean, my father. 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 My father.
Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Francesca Fiorentini. She is a comedian, a journalist. She's the host of the Bitchuation Room. Did I pronounce that correctly, Francesca?
Yes. I mean, I don't know. You have to ask Wolf Blitzer what he thinks about it, but I think so.
I would.
Supposed to be, I don't know, we kill people or we, have really terrible takes on the news. Something happens in that room.
I would love legitimately to ask Wolf Blitzer's take on that name.
Yeah, like we have a segment on the Bitchuation Room called Targeted Character Assassination. I'm not trying to downplay targeted assassinations, but somehow we have to find some levity in the military-industrial complex that is, right?
So yeah, I mean, and so has Wolf been a target?
Not yet, and that is an oversight on my part, absolutely. But it's hard to make fun of someone who's like mannequins. You know what I mean? It's like they're just there. They just sort of, Wolf Blitzer, like he doesn't have expressions on the outside of his face or like emotions, and so it's like a mannequin. Like I can't really make fun of. I mean, he's there. They're just there.
But not all mannequins are like legitimately bad people. I will say this, and I don't know, I'm just putting it out there. I'm definitely not trying to be presumptuous, but if I ever have the honor of being on your show, I request that we character assassinate Wolf Blitzer. That's my only request if that ever happens.
Oh, anytime. Yeah, you've been holding something in for many, many years, it feels like.
I hold something in every time I see him on CNN. No, you know what it is? I think there is something about the fact that on one hand he is like super innocuous, but I've seen him in so many circumstances. I mean, he's just so flagrant with those talking points. So it's like precisely because he's so innocuous, you're like, oh, he just completely brushed off like the burning alive of a wedding party in Afghanistan. That's kind of fucked up.
The crux of this entire story. Yeah, I think if anyone hasn't seen the Bernie Sanders town hall and watching Bernie just kind of like lightly dunk on Wolf Blitzer, it was so good.
That was beautiful. That was another that definitely. I'm a firm bro. So so I want to talk with you about AIPAC.
Oof.
I know. I'm sorry. I should have picked something more pleasant.
It's just ripe for comedy. The Israel-Palestine conflict is just really, if there's one thing they say, it's almost hack. It's so funny,
Well, that is, I do wonder that, like, because on your bio, you literally have like comic and Al Jazeera Plus, and I was like, that's a nice fusion.
Oh yeah, we had the first comedy show for Al Jazeera, so that is a huge credit. When I get introduced to shows, they're like, this woman did the impossible. But yeah, that was our show, News Broke, on AJ Plus, and it was fun. It was We actually we got away with a lot. There were hardly any problems. We spoke openly and freely.
Yep.
I think there was one time, I'm going to be totally frank, we portrayed Jesus. So we had this sketch that was like that if Jesus came back, right, you know, as we're all waiting on him to do,
Right.
and ran on a third-party ticket, Americans would be like, sorry, we gotta vote for Hillary. I mean, come on, we don't want spoilers. Like, screw third parties. I realize he is, the son of God, but think of the Electoral College.
It was a vanity campaign. You got in trouble for that?
Well, we got in trouble because Al Jazeera is not, they're separate from the Qatari government, but that you can't portray prophets, and Jesus is a prophet. So even it was a sketch. We were pushing the limits. But other than that, AJ Plus was an awesome place to have news broke, and maybe one day we'll bring it back.
I was thinking of a follow. You're like a follow-up sketch. Like, what if Muhammad was a bong salesman? What if he ran a head shop? I remember in my experience in the Middle East, both like in Turkey and Israel and the Emirates, and like there is a lot of people in general there are very funny. And I remember I won't tell the whole story, but I was detained going into Israel from Jordan, which is super normal. They don't treat people going in that border well. And
if you don't get detained, you're like, come on, what have I done wrong? I've spoken a lot of truth to power. Like, if you just get through that border, you have to rethink your politics.
Right.
Anyway, go on.
Yeah, like I posted Israel's an apartheid state at least once. Come on, guys. So we were detained for the whole day. This is back in like 2009 or 8. And it was legit. I mean, it was, on one hand, it's like you do have the privilege, frankly, of just knowing that you're American and that like they can ruin your day, which they did, and it's very stressful and you don't have any food, and you do. And I did. I went through multiple rounds of questioning, and they split us up. I remember one time they had one guy to my side, like in my periphery, and then one person standing in front of me, and the guy in my periphery was the one asking me the questions because like it was, it's like unpleasant. But his accent was so thick. He had such a thick like Israeli, like, why are you coming to Jordan? Da, 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 da. And I remember I was just like, dude, I don't understand what you're saying. So I get that this is like supposed to be intimidating, but I can't. If you want me to answer, I need someone who speaks better to me. But
I'm sure he loved that.
Yeah, they did. It was very charming. But at this point, I was pretty angry. But what really hit me about it, and I'm very critical of Israel, to say the least. But we finally get, like, this guy comes to us, and it's like, all right, like, the whole process is done, and we're just going to sit here for a half hour, and then we'll let you know whether or not you come through or you get turned back to Jordan. But just, have some food and relax and whatever. So then he comes back to us a half an hour later, and he goes, I have a good news and a bad news. And at this point, like, what is, like, one of us can go through, one of us can't. Like, it's scary. That was actually the first time I got anxious because the border had already closed at this point. And he goes,
yeah, you don't want any rep of the IDF like telling you good news and bad news. You're like, oh God, bad news is death. I just know somehow there's death.
That's where I was
after
a whole day of being somewhere between like enraged and cool. That was finally where I was like, wait, what? Are we going to like get driven off somewhere? He goes, bad news, we ruin your day. Good news, welcome to Israel. Like,
wow.
It's like, where else would you get a joke like that?
They're so militarized. They have to make jokes about it. Wow. Amazing.
I was like, all right, there is a part of this. I finally got like what other Jews say about this place. I was like, yeah, I do relate to that. I probably would make the same joke. So I want to start. We're going to play this clip from Nancy Pelosi, and I'm just going to go to you and get your reaction to it. Because I do. This is actually pretty stunning because she's been, I mean, it's obvious where she is in terms of her politics and generationally on some of these kind of like obvious divides that are emerging with people like Ilhan Omar. But she's been trying to kind of thread a needle, at least presentationally. And this is like an incredible sort of, planting her foot really firmly in a very extreme side of the equation. So we're going to play that, and then I'll throw to you.
Policy that reaffirms Israel's right to self-defense. In our democratic societies, we should welcome legitimate debate on how best to honor our values and to advance our priorities without questioning loyalty or patriotism. This month, the full House came together to condemn the anti-Semitic myth of dual loyalty and all forms of bigotry with a resolution that, quote, rejects the perpetuation of anti-Semitic stereotypes in the United States and around the world, including the pernicious myth of dual loyalty and foreign allegiance, especially in the context of support for the United States-Israel alliance.
What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, wow. I mean, that last bit, I'm not sure if she's being accurate. I mean, she is painting the resolution in the House that condemned dual loyalty and whatever anti-Semitic trope that wasn't actually an anti-Semitic trope, because this is all in reference to Representative Ilhan Omar. That resolution was incredibly fraught. And in fact, it was expanded upon to include Islamophobia and anti-Black racism and bigotry in a lot of different forms, in part because of the real and justified criticism that Nancy Pelosi and other Democrats received from piling on Ilhan Omar. Right. And in ways that were incredibly Islamophobic, and if not openly Islamophobic, absolutely played into the right's portrayal of Ilhan Omar. So that entire portrayal of the resolution is wrong, I would say. And like the storyline out of that whole resolution isn't that it included dual loyalty or Israel-U.S. relations. The story out of that is that, oh, you were pressured into including all of these other groups because you were caught out in this horribly hypocritical moment where your ties to Israel and a very far right-wing government were greater than your solidarity with another American representative who was being attacked. Right. And so, that immediately was wrong-headed.
Right. And in a context where there is like broader incitement against her, let's also play that we have the Meghan McCain thing as well. Because, I mean, partially just because, like, I would like to take the opportunity with you to make fun of Meghan McCain with me. That's always fun. Maybe we should also, do we also have the montage of the father thing? All right. But this, before we get to... Yeah, please, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that, I mean, AIPAC conferences are so interesting, right? For those folks who like never heard of AIPAC until recently and were just sort of getting up on the Israeli lobby, and remember that AIPAC is just one of many different Israeli lobbying groups. It's one of the biggest. We're like $14.9 million into the 2018 midterm election, midterms. But like, if I remember watching AIPAC speeches from conferences before, and if you ever thought that like your representative or your senator were like, you know, a dove or believed in human rights, or, you know, surely they understand what an occupation is or colonialism is, watch them at an AIPAC conference, because it is a place where everyone's bloodlust just comes to fruition. It's like, oh, this is the place where Democrats kind of get their like hawkish rocks off, or at these conferences. And so, and on top of that, it's like they are pretty much forbidden from mentioning the occupation. Like, they don't talk about the occupation. AIPAC doesn't openly speak about the occupation. And it's sort of where, like, you know, it's kind of like the gym in Congress where like Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi both like take turns on the rower, you know, which happens to be like
That's
Palestinian
a very
human rights.
evocative image, Francesca. Jesus. Whew.
You know, but it's like
Yes.
this is where there's consensus. This is where hawks all doves become hawks. All hawks are always hawks. And I'm not saying that Pelosi is a dove at all, but you had Schumer obviously also taking the opportunity to underhandedly talk about Ilhan Omar at this latest AIPAC conference. He equated calling Nazis good people or decent people with Ilhan Omar's suggestion that, you know, the Israeli lobby was, you know, sort of pulling the strings and purse strings for a lot of representatives, which is real. Like, AIPAC is good money. That's good money. You know, I think we've seen different reps speak out in political campaigns say, like, hey, I went from being a nobody to being a somebody because of AIPAC money, because I took that money. So anyway, all to say is all of this, it's sad. I mean, I think that you're seeing the ways that the lessons of the last month with all the backlash and the discussion of Ilhan Omar and what is anti-Semitism, what is not, what is actually just kind of anti-Black and anti-immigrant and anti-Islam bigotry against her. We're rolling that back, and you see that in this AIPAC conference.
No, I 100%, and I think even like we didn't actually pull it because, I mean, maybe we should have. I mean, Bill de Blasio, you know, he's the mayor of New York City, which is still a very important position. He apparently, someone, most likely himself, has created this sort of delusional concept of him running for president in his head. And, you know, I always give credit where credit is due. So even though I have many, many, many problems with Bill de Blasio, there's no doubt that in like 2013, he was actually speaking about things like inequality before, you know, movements and Sanders put them on the map. Now, he would be running in the left lane in a Democratic primary in this fantasy world where he runs for president. And his speech was, I mean, it was eliminationist almost in terms of Palestinian rhetoric. And I think you're exactly right. Like there is, and even with that resolution, right? Like it turned into a sort of be all, catch all, let's condemn a reform of hate. There was one specific group that wasn't included in that, Palestinians, right? Like it covered literally everybody except the Palestinian people. And this is also on top of the fact that everybody, in addition to distorting her original words, Ilhan Omar came out in a Washington Post op-ed and was like, basically expressed support for a two-state solution. Like she essentially has what we have never acted on in terms of our foreign policy, but just like consensus U.S. foreign policy. And they're still lying about her every step of the way.
Yeah, exactly. And all of this is thanks to the fact that, you know, the 2018 midterms, despite AIPAC's money, saw the election of the first two female Muslim representatives, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and it's amazing. And the fact that we're even having these conversations is so huge and potentially could change U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, starting within Congress, which I think it needs to. And I think the other thing that you might have it, but the other thing that I think Democrats are being faced with is this idea of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, right? Pelosi at the same AIPAC conference, I think I have the quote here, called it a dangerous ideology masquerading as policy.
Right.
And she called it bigoted. She called BDS bigoted. And it's like, that is, talk about not remembering, you know, apartheid South Africa and the boycott movements against that. It's just such it's so hypocritical, and actually speaks to something that I've talked about, and I think in terms of the ways that people have spoken about Ilhan Omar, is that when Black Americans specifically get, you know, work for justice for Palestinians and speak out about it, they are come down upon 10 times harder. Like you see Mark Lamont Hill, the CNN contributor who was fired after his comments. And that's really interesting. And it's like, oh, because here you have, you know, Black Americans going through their own civil rights struggles, still struggling for equality. And if they're making these links to this oppressed people in the, in Israel, like suddenly the whole moralistic framework for, the Israeli project falls on its ass, Excuse me, sorry, I don't know if I can say that.
Yeah, you definitely can say that. I also think like the other funny part of the relationship between Israel, South Africa, and black activism is when you have like family email threads where it's like a column from some kid who was sent on a junket to Israel saying South Africa and Israel are totally not comparable. And then you can respond with a column by Desmond Tutu called like South Africa and Israel are comparable. But
wow.
But I mean, like, that is like what's incredible is like Ronnie Kasrils, who is Jewish and was an icon of the liberation movement in South Africa. He's like, it's the same thing. Nelson Mandela said, we're not free until Palestinians are free. Like, it's clear. I mean, it's so clear. And I think that, yeah, in some ways that is I mean, I think, though, that's like the liberal remnant of a certain defense of Israel, because I think what you're actually seeing now under Netanyahu is a much more overt, like Olmert and Barak were the type of politicians who would say correctly, like, you know what, we can't do this indefinitely because at a certain point, younger Jewish people are going to be uncomfortable with this because they're not really into this. Netanyahu is like, we can team up with neo-fascist parties in Europe. We're cool with Trump. We're cool with Republicans.
In America, yeah.
Yeah, like neo-fascists in America, precisely. Like, cool. They want their own
Mind you, and
ethno-state.
I think someone made this point, and I think it's really important. It's like, what didn't AIPAC? If AIPAC truly is concerned about anti-Semitism, did they not open their entire conference with a surviving family member of the Squirrel Hill synagogue shooting?
Right.
Like, that just happened, and it's really important that we remember that, and especially, not as an American Jew, but I think for American Jews to understand, like, there is a different way, and there is a way that we can, like, tackle anti-Semitism in earnest and not let the Democratic leadership take up all the air on that issue.
In the last couple of minutes, though, I do just want to say that what you're saying and what I'm saying is really scary. And that's a cue to play the Meghan McCain clip. Can we play the Meghan McCain clip, please? Yes, thank you.
Israel. Many of you know there are people out there today, including in the halls of Congress, who believe that America supports Israel only because AIPAC is powerful. That line, recalling so many pernicious stereotypes, is a profound misunderstanding of how American democracy works. Americans don't support Israel because AIPAC is influential. AIPAC is influential because Americans support Israel.
Well, thoughts?
Oh, that's hilarious. Did you want to, you thought that was going to be funny? Oh, man, that actually is funny. It's funny, and here's why it's funny. Because Christian, the only way that's funny, oh, God, it's not funny, but Christian Zionists, like, she could have just ended that, Americans support Israel because Christian Zionists want to get all the Jews together for Jesus to come back and then destroy them and take us to heaven. Like, that is literally the kinds of allies that Meghan McCain has, and that's who she's, like, dog whistling to, is people who just think that, like, end of times are going to be hastened by, the state of Israel being so-called returned, or the Holy Land being returned to the Jews. I mean, the pathology is so scary. Also, as a comic,
yes,
Meghan McCain needs to get off The View. Like, make space for someone. Well, actually, I mean, she's pretty damn funny. When she cries,
I was going to say,
it's like
I don't know.
a part of me.
I don't know.
It's really good. She's good TV, but, like, she's also, make way for other people. She's taking up the space there.
Well,
and she's also gonna run.
everything
Can you
she
hear her? She's gonna
represents, like
run.
everything wrong in our world.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, her being on The View is like it's like, why do you support the estate tax? this Meghan McCain clip? Why are you socialist? This Meghan McCain clip. Why do you support like getting rid of legacy admissions? Oh, I have a Meghan McCain clip. For you.
My father, 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 my father's my father, my father, my father, my father, my father.
It's hypnotic.
Honest God, I can't, like, between, I mean, listen, when the right can roll out they're all about, like, women are, the feminists aren't really, at the Women's March, like, they don't really believe in feminism. They don't lift up all women because they don't lift up the women who've only relied on their fathers and their husbands for notoriety. Like, get the F out of here, man. I'm so sick of that. And I will, like, Huckabee Sanders, Meghan McCain, Ivanka Trump, just like, yeah, all respect to you. But honestly, you're a rich kid. You're just another rich kid who's been crowned important to listen to. And I'm tired of that.
Fuck you as a staff record label and as a crew.
Yes.
Francesca Fiorentini.
And honestly,
yes?
sorry, when Meghan, when she comes out with her Nordstrom line, I'm not gonna buy it. Nuh-uh. Don't you get me to buy that.
That's
Nordstrom
principled
rack.
leadership.
Yes. Some anti-capitalist principled leadership. Anyway, thanks, Michael, for having me on.
Hey, that was awesome. I really appreciate it. We'll hopefully have you on again in the future. Check out the Bitchuation Room with Francesca Fiorentini. And thanks again, Francesca. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael.
Take care. All right, folks, here's what we're going to do. That was fun. Every time you have, and honestly, there's not a single guest on the show I haven't liked. But every time you do a first round with somebody, it's always, because I like basically a broad swath of returnees, and then you've got like the core, because I like the kind of community vibe. But obviously you need to introduce new people and kind of and also inject new energy. But there's always that little thing of like, hey, is this going to work? And so I thought that worked quite well. David Griscom, do you have an economic minute for us? You going to enlighten us
I
on
do
the
have an economic
global
minute.
dynamics of our economic world?
Well, we had to go back, given the strike in LA, we had to go back and talk about what's going on at Uber and generally with these companies. We were talking about these IPOs that are coming up and the need for companies like Uber and Lyft, which is basically have been losing money on all of their rides,
Right.
to start squeezing workers. And as we saw, the people who were striking in LA, they were striking because they have seen a pay cut per mile, 25%, as Michael said, which has gone down from 80 cents to 60 cents per mile. And that's a significant pay cut for people. And, there's no doubt that, the pressure that is coming on, the drivers in LA is coming because of this upcoming IPO and wanting to make the company wants to show that it can be more profitable and squeeze workers even more. And we're only going to see more of this as as the next couple of weeks unfold. And these, Lyft is going up for their IPO at the end of the week, and we're going to start seeing even more of these kind of push. So, we see this big strike on Monday. This is only possible because there has been such an incredible movement to start to try to organize these workers. The organization that was really behind this, Rideshare Drivers United, has grown from 300 drivers just a year ago to 3,000 today. And that's the kind of power that is able to, to come at a city like LA and to really make the demands of people be heard. It's important to note that not only are people asking to return to the old payment, they want more. They want a $28 per hour minimum rate. But it wasn't just, LA. Lyft, who has their IPO coming up at the end of the week, they've seen a lot of pressure from their drivers as well. Just yesterday, I believe, in San Francisco, Lyft was having an event to woo new investors and buyers that they actually moved locations day of. And they cited it was because they needed a larger space, but I think it was much more likely that the fact that there was a massive protest that was being unfurled outside of the venue was behind that. So, there's a lot of pressure on these companies and people are becoming more and more vocal. And it's important because, what folks who are, driving in these ride service companies are facing is really steep. Just in Uber alone, there's about 900,000 active drivers a year. But on average, only 4% of drivers are coming back year after year. So if you think about that, that's massive turnover when you're talking about drivers. And it's because of the highly exploitative practices that you see at these companies. They draw people in, with sign-up bonuses and things like that. And then, they start to drive for them for a while, and then they stop making much money. Most of the time, making much less than minimum wage. When you're looking at a company like Uber, the average hourly rate is $10.87 an hour, which is not much at all.
That's incredible.
And when you're talking about somebody who then has to pay for all their own expenses.
Yeah, they have to pay all their own.
Exactly. And they have to, get their own health care and being treated as a private contractor. And we need to talk about this for a second. How the hell is Uber and Handy and all of these other corporations able to get around worker laws that we've fought so hard to put in place to protect people from being exploited? Well, it's because these companies have massive lobbying organizations that have been able to push governments around, and because of the fact that the workers are so displaced, a lot of them are in transition, that they're able to exploit them at a really high rate. So a very important report just came out in the Texas Observer, which is a really great local regional outfit, that they came out and they found that the Texas Workforce Commission, which is a government agency in Texas that basically looks over unemployment insurance for the state, that they had been privately lobbied by Handy, which is another one of these big companies that perform services like cleaning your apartment, things like that, that they had just sent in lobbyists directly into this unelected branch of government to change the rules so that they could, so that the state would consider the workers to be contractors, and that companies like Uber, Lyft, and Handy would be considered marketplace platforms. So instead of going through the legislature, which is where you're seeing a lot of these fights happening, these companies are now trying to find workarounds, to find the government agency that can just implement a rule statewide and can change it. And this was something that was done with very little fanfare. It turns out that one of the main lobbyists involved is a group called Tusk Ventures, which just so happens to have a large holding in Uber. So I mean, it's pretty, it's pretty sneaky, the kind of stuff that's going on. And, don't forget the struggle that you have when you're trying to come up against these companies. In a city like Austin, for example, they had a public initiative to try to force Uber and Lyft to run better background checks on their drivers. And these companies came so hard, and then the city voted for these background checks, and then Uber and Lyft just left. And then we found out that they lobbied like crazy, and they got the Texas state legislature, so a bunch of people from outside of Austin, basically, to pass the law to overturn what happened in Austin. So these companies have massive power, and the only way that we're going to be able to defeat them is, one, through supporting actions like we're seeing in LA. Don't forget, in New York City, there was a lot of success in creating a minimum pay rate for drivers in this city. And that only came because there's a massive amount of organizing, and that's so important. We need to be aware of it. We also need to be vigilant about these kind of sneaky workarounds that are going on. And look, I really would like to see Bernie Sanders start running a little bit of his Amazon magic on these Uber and Lyft companies and start calling them out specifically for what they're doing.
That'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, let's see if they sponsor the convention this year.
Let's see if they sponsor the convention this year. And let's also, look, I'm all for Bernie should, and that's great, and let's always keep constructively pushing Bernie. But I frankly like Elizabeth Warren, who I think has legitimate progressive credentials, and Tulsi Gabbard, who is a very complicated case but has some credentials and is trying to run in that lane, let alone the ones who I think frankly have no credentials but are trying to run in that lane. Like, Joe Biden is the worst, but he's going to come out and give a whole bunch of ridiculous comments about how he's the most progressive in all of this. Well, I'll tell you what, if Joe came out and said, I'm the most progressive, and let me tell you, my first step is the Lyft and Uber drivers are right. Okay. Well, there you go. There are some points on the board.
He would never do that, yeah.
Well, of course he would never do that, but I just want to say in general, I do think there's a dual tactic where it's like there's the legitimate request to Bernie. Like, can you do this because you actually might and you care and it could help? And then I think there's also the other metric of like, oh, okay, other great progressive Democratic candidates. Well, there's a fight going on for Uber and Lyft drivers right now. So First of all, let's look at your campaign
Yeah, we need to
contributions.
make
And
this-
secondly, I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
We need to make this an issue, just like the minimum wage has become an issue. And look, there's some people who push for like a bold minimum wage. There's also the kind of, crappy version, very slow rollout. But at least it's becoming something that, Democrats are talking about on a large scale.
Definitely.
We need Democrats to start pushing them to start recognizing that we cannot have this underclass of newly categorized workers who are basically, working contract work in general. Is
Absolutely.
becoming this ridiculous class where people aren't being protected, and then people are being forced to pay the costs that employers should be paying, and we should not allow this to be happening in 2019.
All right, folks, here's what we're going to do. We have an interview I just recorded about, what would you say, about 6 o'clock? So a little about an hour before we started. And I think this interview is about 34 minutes or so, something like that. Oh, it's 40 minutes. All right, so we're going to play this Matt Taibbi interview. It's brand new. Just so happened we couldn't do it live. And then, of course, we're going to come back. We're going to complete things. We're going to tell you to buy your tickets to LA and become a patron again. And then we'll go on over to the postgame. But for now, check out this conversation with Matt Taibbi on Russia. You guys ready to go? Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is return guest, proud to say crew, Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone magazine. Also check him out as a way you can get his current ebooks and other work, taibbi.substack.com. Matt Taibbi, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So Matt, you've just take it broad. I mean, what is your reaction to the summary of the Mueller report? And if I understand you correctly, your critique, if we were to take 3 lanes, there's the probe around Donald Trump, then there's the intelligence community, and then there's the media, and maybe the Democratic sort of establishment, if you want to kind of fit that in there as well. I feel like a lot of your critique, if I'm reading you correctly, is about the media. But what's your main takeaway from this 2.5-year process and where we find ourselves today, or takeaways?
Well, I mean, assuming that there isn't some mind-blowing thing in the Mueller report that somehow doesn't rise to the level of criminality, but is shocking evidence of espionage. What they did write in the report and what we've seen from the excerpt says, flat out that members of the Trump campaign, they don't have any evidence that they conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. So they were very specific about that, because they did outline a couple of areas in which the Russian government supposedly interfered with the election, mainly through the leaking and then through the Facebook memes. Mm-hmm. But they drew a line and said they could not establish a connection between the Trump campaign and any of those activities. So, given that we've spent now 2.5 years basically chasing this story, more or less operating under the assumption that it was true most of the time. It's an epic fail on the part of the media, and it's going to validate every criticism that Donald Trump ever had of the press. And my worst fear about all this is that it's going to get him reelected, frankly, because he's got a gigantic issue to run on now.
What do you think? So, I'll cop to the fact that I think that, and it's really hitting me in the last couple of days, that I honestly just followed this, I think, less than most people in general. And I think like the only time that we talked about it on this show is when you were on several months ago. And I'm not saying I was in no way like prescient on it. I didn't say like, oh yeah, this didn't happen. I said, look, it seems like there's some sketchy shit there. Let's do an investigation and see what happens. Meanwhile, let's focus on like the millions of other actual daily occurring atrocities and scandals and, general horror show of this administration, and kind of like the broader crumbling of U.S. empire. But as we re-review this, how did this become such established wisdom? Like, is it an intelligence failure? Is it a media failure? But is it also like a psychological need amongst a certain class of people to not self-assess? Like, or was it legit? Like, oh, this did look sketchy, so let's check it out.
Well, there are a lot of unanswered questions there. I think we're going to have to go back in history, because for all the reporting that's been done on this subject, and there have been thousands and thousands of articles and exposés and television reports about it, relatively little has been done on the origin story of how this all got started.
Yeah.
There were a few reports. Remember, there are a couple of different versions of how the official investigation began. Originally, it came out in the New York Times that the FBI began it because of concern about Carter Page. Then it was George Papadopoulos and his activities that worried them. Then it came out later in the New Yorker that this all started when the head of the British analog to the NSA, Robert Hannigan, who's the head of the GCHQ, got some intercepts between Trump people and Russians and was concerned enough to come to America, brief the CIA, which in turn briefs the FBI, which supposedly starts the investigation. But we don't know what was in those intercepts. We don't know what those conversations were about. We just don't know what started all this. And I hate to make a ridiculous comparison, but if you remember the Deflategate scandal.
Yeah, I do actually. And are you gonna smear the Pats or are you gonna defend the Pats?
I'm actually not. I'm gonna do neither. I'm a Patriots fan, so I better admit that, which is going to make me hated by everybody.
I can see it right now. It's like, so first Beth Taibbi defends Trump and Russia, and now Brady.
But when the Deflategate thing happened, I thought I had the same issue with that story, which was that nobody was telling us how it got started. Like, somebody had to tell somebody else to go measure the footballs, right?
Right.
Because that's not normal. And so I started digging into, just for my own sake as a fan. I wanted, I shouldn't admit this, but I, told everybody I was working on a story for Rolling Stone, and I started calling up teams, and all of a sudden I realized I was getting different answers, right? Like, nobody would tell me what exactly happened. Like, there was one source that I got that told me that it was because the Ravens had tipped off the Colts. Another source told me that it was because the Colts had intercepted a ball in their previous game with the Patriots and thought it was too soft. And then a third person told me that the Colts had actually seen somebody messing with the balls in the previous game that they had played that year. And, in my mind, it's a way more legitimate story if somebody in the Colts actually saw that happen. And I tried to nail that down. I tried to confirm that was the case. That makes the investigation legitimate if that happens. If it's just somebody in the Ravens going through the rule book and saying, you know what, I bet none of these idiot referees know anything about physics, and when they test the balls, they won't realize that they're going to measure softer than usual because of the cold weather. That's a completely different story. So it's important to know how things start, right? And I ended up not writing about that subject because I could never figure out how it started. Mm-hmm. And in this case, we have the same problem, which is that it's hard to know whether the story is legitimate or not because we don't know where the origin is. And and for all the reporters who have been on it, nobody's been able to nail it down. And so I'm sorry to go off in that soliloquy, but I think it's a failure on that level because we haven't been able to look at the whole forest for the trees yet.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe the last example you use is the Steele dossier, where it's just like, hey, let's just drop this thing out in the ecosystem, and it's kind of just like speculative oppo research, and we can just like see what happens with it. And I'm not gonna like, I don't know that much about that world at all, but I know enough to know about like. Reports get made by companies like that are a lot less precise than you might think. It's all I'll say. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
Like
of
people
course.
are running around like, oh yeah, Fusion GPS. That's really serious shit, man. It's like, yeah, okay. I knew some guy who was like, like passed out in the back of like a Cold War quiz in college. He was like the lead investigator on something like that. And it doesn't mean, they don't know how to use Google and make phone calls or whatever, but it isn't like scientific process. Do you?
Right. Yeah.
So I want to table a few things though, and see if we can like just run through some of these different like kind of almost like of if we took the story in like three pairs and kind of like or three areas and take it.
You can't have three pairs.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, you can. I'm sorry.
No, it's
I thought you
fine.
meant three halves.
Dude, you
Anyway,
just
yeah,
cleared Brady, so I'm happy. It's great. Brady's innocent.
I'm not sure I did actually, but anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, you did, and anybody who said otherwise is totally lying because of resentment about the success of the Pats organization. So, well, actually, let me just do these first before we get to that. Do you? Okay, so let's get rid of like the really, just like night in the Monty Python movie, like the report hasn't been released yet, and that will show X and blah 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 blah. Which, by the way, I want to say the report absolutely, in my mind, should 100% be released, and we should, as like a matter of politics, demand that, and also fight back against how Trump is using this to sort of burnish his own authoritarian fantasies and grudges against the media, for sure. But on the other hand, like, okay, I agree with you. I don't think that Barr wrote a summary that is like, oh, well, if you drop every other comma, what it really is saying is Mueller is like, go to the national monument, and under that is the secret dossier that will reveal that Trump, got peed on, but it was in Bucharest, right? Like, there's the real stretches that people are doing on this, but there is the kind of broader, like, do we necessarily take at face value, an attorney general who's obviously like a Republican operative who, essentially in his confirmation hearings was pretty much like, yeah, I'm not going to, I'm going to play with the team type of thing. What's the balance between figuring out, not going to like conspiracy theories about how the real Mueller report, will still show us X, Y, Z. I think maybe it will, but I think that's incredibly far-fetched. Whereas on the other hand, getting into this other like weird position where we're just like, oh yeah, a Republican, authoritarian administration. I totally take the AG's word for it on like the potential tons of crimes of the president, setting aside even just this stuff with like the collusion thing.
Well, right, but again, you don't have to infer anything.
Yeah.
You can look at the indictments that have been issued so far, and the undeniable fact that there aren't going to be any more from Mueller. So that tells us one thing to begin with. Then there's the second thing, which is that the two most important quoted sections in the summary spoke directly to the two biggest issues that everybody was worried about. The first one was collusion, and I've already quoted the line from that. The second one has to do with obstruction, and Mueller did an interesting thing. He punted it back to Barr, and surely he must have known that meant the end of any obstruction cases when he did that, because Barr has already essentially said he doesn't really, and someone insanely, he's already said something to the effect of he doesn't believe the president can really obstruct justice. But beyond that, Mueller wrote this thing that said the evidence does not establish that the president was involved in an underlying crime related to election interference, Russian election interference. So that speaks to the whole issue of, it's kind of like resisting arrest. Like, yeah, you can be, brought in for resisting arrest, but it's not lawful. That charge isn't lawful unless there is an underlying crime that was valid. So we have to weigh the issue of whether or not the obstruction thing, how meaningful it is, given the fact that Mueller couldn't find an underlying crime to sort of apply to the obstruction issue.
Right.
And, of course, I don't, I would, if this were just an internal Bill Barr investigation of Trump, of course you'd be right to be completely skeptical of anything that he would say. But the thing that speaks the loudest is the absence of arrests and indictments that would speak to a larger conspiracy. And then the other thing is just the quotes from the report. So, there might be, I'm sure there's all kinds of stuff in there that's going to be, probably devastating to Trump if and when it ever becomes public. But, it's not about this.
Right.
We can feel pretty safe in saying it's not about this.
Right. Do you think that if do you think that if out of the gate people said, what about Trump's relation? Because there's all these, the dude seems to me to be like an incredibly corrupt guy generally. If you said, there was the collusion with Israel to undermine the Obama resolution or abstain on the vote condemning settlements. I don't know if you call that collusion or whatever, but inappropriate work with a foreign government during the transition. There's all of these different relationships with these Emirati and Gulf money sources, Michael Flynn in Turkey. If people out of the gate, instead of turning it into like a Tom Clancy thing, made it like a oligarchy and influence peddling period thing, I mean, maybe I'm answering my own question, but would that have been more effective? But on the other hand, that's the type of thing where if you open it up like that, that means you could start threatening the entire modern political establishment.
Well, look, yeah, that's exactly the case. And in fact, when this whole business started, I went down to Washington and I spoke to an investigator on a senatorial committee who kind of laughed about the whole thing because they had, before Russiagate happened, they had been preparing a sort of big sweeping look at the Foreign Agents Registration Act, because it's an open secret in Washington that, Washington's basically Rome, and all the countries in the world come to Washington bearing tribute, right, in the hopes of getting, X, Y, and Z policy approved. And so there's just this incredible, roaring river of money that's coming from abroad that's flowing to politicians. And it's doing it through this, fairly well-established system of lobbyists and K Street lawyers. And if they had gone out in there with a sort of broader mandate to look at the entire spectrum of improper activity and foreign money influencing elections, they would have found all kinds of stuff. This actually was one of the reasons that I was so kind of down on the Russia story to begin with, because I don't doubt that Russia tries to influence America's elections. I would imagine they're thinking of trying every conceivable angle to do so. But everything that I've heard over the years, leading up to this incident, tells me that they're probably not even in the top 10 in terms of the countries that do this. And it's both parties, but probably more on the Republican side, I would say, actually. because a lot of it has to do with energy policy. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And if they had done it that way, it would have been more legitimate. But they couldn't do it that way for reasons that are kind of obvious, because that would have imperiled everybody in the the current political establishment.
I mean, so power-wise, it's obvious, but psychologically, like, when you indict the media class in a way, or maybe I shouldn't use the word indict, but whatever. When you criticize the media class, do you think it's the psychological need of whether it's MSNBC or making Robert De Niro do Robert Mueller on Saturday Night Live, all this kind of embarrassing stuff, the need to not deal with the fact that, that we are Rome or whatever, like, that it you can't just outsource all of your troubles to Trump, right? Like, or even on the other hand, like when people say like, oh, Russia with their social media campaigns, they exploited, racial divisions as an example. It's like, well, sure, because America is an incredibly racist country with a massive police violence problem, right? Like, these things didn't, like, Putin didn't have the guy choke Eric Garner to death. Like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Right. Yeah. I think this whole story grew out of an earlier problem that the press had, which was the inability to take Trump seriously as a candidate. And it was sort of uniformly everybody dismissed even the idea that he could win even the nomination. You had people from the Washington Post talking about, Dana Milbank said, I'll eat my column if he wins the nomination. So he ended up having to do that, which was funny. But the reason they all thought that is because they're kind of out of touch with how people think about the sort of current status quo of the American political establishment. And it has so many flaws, and there are so many long-standing problems that have gone unaddressed, from job security to police abuse to environmental issues to if you go to any part of the country, there are places where there isn't a viable obstetrician, a birthing center, a place where women can have babies for hundreds of miles, and so the country has all these problems, and because of the way we cover campaigns, we just don't really look at this stuff, and so there's lots of discontent in the population that seems irrational when it's covered by the Washington and New York media, which isn't seeing all of this. So they come up with all these other explanations for what happened, and I think that was one of the reasons why the Russia explanation was so attractive, because there was no other way to account for what happened, in 2016. Whereas, there was a wide-ranging sort of movement that included the Sanders movement on the other side. Yep. That was really just about anger about stuff that was going on, and we got to look at all those things.
Do you think that you wrote as the Mueller probe ends, the new Russiagate myth begins? What does that mean?
Well, we're gonna, the way these things work is, if they can't go with one storyline, they're going to move instantaneously to another. I said this before, but journalists are kind of like wildebeest. It's, as soon as 51% of them decide to run one way, they all run. And the new talking point today is going to be demanding the entire Mueller report, which I agree with. We should see it. But we're going to transition from Donald Trump is might be guilty of collusion. Mueller's going to save us from by telling us the truth about Trump's relationship to Russia. That's all gone now, so we're going to move on to let's see the report. Then if the report doesn't come out, there's going to be a congressional uproar, and we're going to follow that for a while. And so they're going to create a news story about how the real problem is the sort of obstruction that's going on by Republicans to prevent this from becoming public. Also, they're going to switch emphasis from collusion to obstruction. That's going to be the new thing, because there's a dichotomy of opinion about that. So this is what always happens. It's what happened with the WMD thing. Like the instant we stopped being able to argue that there were weapons over the next hill, the next thing was, well, we actually did this because Saddam Hussein was such a terrible dictator, and now we're going to make the country better. And I know people object to that comparison, but this is what happens when the whole press corps gets sort of on a when we get swept up in these sort of manias, and they sometimes get us off track, and rather than kind of stop in place and say, whoa, how did we get here? Maybe we should re-examine what we did. We always just sort of move to the next thing. And that next thing is not always, better.
And even as part of that WMD thing, wasn't it also the case that, like I was in college, I wasn't covering it, so you definitely know better than me. Wasn't it also the case that even before they made that shift, when just literally there were no WMDs there, that it was a absolute media consensus, even amongst like the handful of people that could occasionally voice a dissent about just invading Iraq, that Saddam Hussein definitely had some form of weapons. Now, like Bush and Blair were saying like, oh yeah, he could nuke us in a matter of minutes, like insane claims like that. But even more measured, even like anti-war voices, a lot of them took as like a matter of assumption that there is some continuous weapons program there. Isn't that also another maybe analogy there too, of just like the broad? I was looking at those New York Times headlines you had in your piece, where it was like written as just a matter of already established fact that, there was this relationship. And again, I say not like, oh, that's weird. Like, why does he want those notes torn up like after the meeting? Like, I think there's a whole bunch of individual things that are like, yeah, that's weird. But it was never an established fact.
Yeah, no. The consensus opinion, the range that was allowed was they have weapons. They're an immediate threat. They could have a nuke within a year. We have to go in now. That was one view. That was sort of the majority view on most of the networks. And then the extreme liberal anti-war view that was occasionally allowed was we should at least wait for the inspections to be completed before we go in.
Right.
So that was the range of opinion that was permitted at the time, and you're right, and so this is again one of the problems that we have with the way the media is set up these days. Is it's just too homogenized, like within organizations even. I thought it was fascinating when James Horizon was hired by the Intercept, and he immediately put out an article called something about treason, where he basically disagreed fundamentally with everything that Glenn Greenwald had been saying about Russiagate.
Right.
And I thought that was, I didn't agree with Horizon, but I thought that was cool. I thought, that's the way news organizations should be. You should have people debating each other, even within their own pages. But the reaction within the business was like that this somehow reflected poorly on either the Intercept or Greenwald or something, that even his own staff members didn't agree with him, and which just made no sense.
They had a great debate
so
on a podcast. I forget the forum, but like they even sat down and Scahill hosted a debate. It was great. It was fascinating.
Yeah. Exactly, and that's what we should have, really about all issues. But with certain stories, there's no debate allowed anymore. I mean, you just don't see anybody in the sort of quote unquote mainstream press taking the contra point of view on for instance this issue. Like, what's going on with this investigation? Do we agree with it? Does it make sense? The other side of the argument is all buried in conservative media that liberal audiences don't see. And the converse has been true for 30 years. I mean, Fox viewers don't see half the news or even 3/4 of the news that liberal audiences see, because it's just not presented on Fox or in the Daily Caller or Newsmax or whatever. That's just totally unhealthy. Like, we should be able to see the full spectrum of arguments always.
You already said it, but I mean, just in the last minute, you think, like, is this all we're going to hear from Trump for like the next however long it is?
Well, it depends. I mean, if the report actually comes out and there's all kinds of lurid stuff in there, it's it could easily be flipped on him and not be such a winner. I've heard a rumor, that there's some things in the report that would indicate that he was sort of actively seeking other business interests in Russia longer than has already been reported. But
that makes sense.
That Mueller didn't find that to rise to the level of criminality or collusion. But it's still embarrassing. However, if it's, as things stand right now, I think he's going to, even last time he made the media a cornerstone of his approach. He painted us as the elite out to get him, and very importantly, to delegitimize the political beliefs of ordinary people. They're going to see us now, if this thing plays out the way it did. He's going to be able to paint that as the media in America did not respect your decision to vote for me, and they tried to overturn it through non-democratic means. That's going to be his argument, and that's going to be a powerful thing for him on the stump. I hate to say it. It's tough.
Matt Taibbi, is there a Mueller report part 2? A lot of people are asking themselves
that. Will there be another Mueller report?
Yes, that's the Rachel Maddow question.
That's the Rachel Maddow question. Well, there are going to be congressional inquiries, right? So this is going to keep going. It's not going to stop. I mean, there's no way it's over. As I'm finding out in a big way, this is by no means settled in most people's minds. So it's going to continue to be a political issue that's going to be driven with incredible ferocity for quite a long time. And I think probably the congressional committees are going to be the sort of new Mueller investigations or Mueller investigation.
Jesus, I was just trying to do the Maddow impression, but it already sounds exhausting. I just want to say, like, I always hit my, like, obviously the Brazil stuff is really key to me. And I just think, like, the last thing I'll say is very different circumstances. And I think there actually was something like a legitimate, I mean, there definitely was a inappropriate removal of a president from office and a political imprisonment without material evidence of another one. And it was, fake and dangerous and very real and horrifying ways, and targeting a party of the honorable social democratic tradition. But I do think more broadly, I wish people would consider, like, getting back to the idea that even with, and maybe even most especially with horrible authoritarians, you have to get in there and ruthlessly and, with a lot of intensity and ferocity and speaking to people's actual interests, beat them. Through the means we have set to beat them. And you don't ever want to weaponize the judiciary or intelligence services or whatever else to settle your political scores for you, because that will never, especially if you represent the center to left, that's not going to win for you in the long term.
Yeah, it's a characteristic of third world countries to try to settle differences through the criminal justice system or through secret services, or we want to have these arguments in election years, and we want to do it in a kind of spirit of openness too. I think it was amazing to me watching Chris Matthews say, like almost shruggingly yesterday, that once he realized that they don't have him on collusion, he's like, well, now the Democrats have to win the election, and he was like depressed about that.
He said that,
and
that's a good line.
And
Oh,
I mean, you're having exactly the right reaction. Like, how could that not be funny? Like I was amazed that other people on the panel didn't burst out laughing. He was on with Joe Scarborough and everything, and Mika, and like he says this,
the brain trust.
and there's no like laugh line there. Nobody broke out laughing. But yeah, we don't want to be doing this. Like this was the whole point. Like this kind of thing started with Whitewater,
right.
Which was an attempt to, but it's been going on for a while. We had Watergate, which was a real thing, but then we had Iran-Contra, which was another real issue. But progressively, the political parties started to realize that we could tie up the entire national dialogue with these kinds of investigations, and man, it's exhausting, right? Like, who wants to deal with this? Like, I think that's one of the reasons people hate government is because of this stuff. I mean, in the old days, the Republican and Democratic committee heads would go play golf on the weekends, and that's how they would work out who would get what in the appropriations bills. And you'd never hear, their interplay. And I kind of wish we lived back in those days. You know what I mean? Like this ongoing combat, it's just exhausting, isn't it?
I think it's exhausting. Well, and this is my Marxist shit. It also is I do think we have to do a lot of combat, because I do think that the resources of the earth are being sucked up by an incredibly small amount of people in a totally horrific and unsustainable and hierarchical way. And there is going to need to be a lot of battles, but we should do the actual battles instead of the scoring on each other on social media through proxy cultural identification battles. I mean, I'll tell you bluntly, and my bad, I forget the name of the book, but I think you wrote a book in like 2007 or something on, was it called, I don't know, was it The Great Divide? I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it. But
The Great Derangement.
The Great Derangement. But I loved your argument that there's these huge cultural divisions that are being exploited. And again, I don't look, I'm on the side that supports gay rights and says you should drive a clean car. Like, I'm not saying these things aren't real, particularly when it comes to people's rights, obviously. But I loved how you juxtaposed it. At least in that book, I think you're right. It's probably already changed, but at least in that book, you're like, yeah, like people are pounding each other on all of this, different sort of subcultural shit. And then in Washington, they're just sitting out dispensing the rewards to Exxon or Lockheed. And I still think even today, a lot of that dynamic exists.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. Even in the era of Trump, the culture war between red and blue is a distraction from the real political battle, which is kind of between rich and poor, or rich and everybody else.
Yeah.
And it's more of a 99-1 battle than it is a 50-50 battle. And I think I strongly believe that these divisions between conservatives and progressives have been amplified as much as possible by the powers that be in an effort to distract us from all the issues that you're talking about, whether it's pollution, climate change, the manipulation of the economy to favor the financial services industry, the sort of like erosion of the tax base, the elimination of corporate taxes, the creation of loopholes, the end of social programming, all that stuff. And so while we're fighting each other, we don't have our eyes on that ball, and so yeah.
If we
I
get
agree
Bernie Sanders
with you on that.
elected, it's going to be even more energy to actually get Medicare for All passed. Like I'm saying, we got to be ready for when these things actually hit us, right? Like as the actual battles, like you're saying.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
Matt Taibbi, as always, man, I appreciate it, and I look forward to your next in-studio visit.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks,
and
man.
say hi to
Appreciate
everyone
it.
for me. All right, bye-bye.
All right, everybody, that was the great Matt Taibbi. We're going to go to the post game where patrons get Discord questions and calls, and we're inaugurating a new segment. Ben Burgess, the debunker. He's author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. It will be available on pre-order from Zero Books soon. This is going to be an indispensable book for everybody. He was the main guest on the show a couple weeks ago, and we're going to be doing these segments for patrons over the next couple of weeks.
It might be pushing it to float this in the public show, but is he another person who should maybe team up with Destiny?
Maybe so. That's
just wondering.
Something to wonder about. Musi Maimani, he's South Africa's Beto O'Rourke, according to Ben Fogel, and that is correct. And we're going to do a little mini history of modern South African politics right up to the contradictions of Cyril Ramaphosa, the rolling blackouts that are happening, review of AMLO's first 100 days. I debated another Mayo brain on I-24. We'll do a review of that. Chuck Schumer is going in the gulag, and the most disturbing political ad maybe ever conceived of. Join us at patreon.com/TMBS, patreon.com/TMBS. Do not wait to get your tickets to the Bootleg Theater, April 20th. Left is Best West Coast Fest. TMBS Live with Anna Kasparian, Big Waz, Wesley Lambre, Nando Vila, and of course, all of us. See you in the postgame.